Tennessee football is a week and a half away from spring practice. And what does that mean? That means one step closer to the Nico era taking flight, even more so than it did in the bowl game to cap last season. Welcome into the Volunteer State. I'm Blake Toppmeyer alongside the Knoxville News Sentinel's Adam Sparks. Adam, as we record this, I know you are preparing for vacation, a last breather, one that you did not get really while you were covering all this NCAA back and forth for the last several weeks. But you got a vacation coming up. We thought we'd dive into spring practice before you left, and I know you'll be back in time to start the beginning of spring. So set the stage for us, I guess. Right off the jump, why should Tennessee fans be interested in what happens in spring practice? What's going to grab Vols fans' eye?
Well, I mean, Nico is the obvious one, and I know we're going to talk Nico. We're going to talk Nico every week from now till probably the end of December. But there's a lot of other reasons. I mean, mostly transfers to me. Now, I think probably a lot of fans would say, well, transfers and also freshmen, the recruits, because most of those guys, more than half of the class is already on campus and will make their debut on the field. I'm always a guy that's hesitant to project freshmen as having an impact. So I'm looking at the transfers, and there's 7, 8, 9 transfers, all at key positions. That's why you get transfers. But that's what I'm mostly going to look at. And I mean, we'll go through some of them, but your starting offensive tackle, probably your left tackle, is a transfer. He has to hit. One of your wide receivers may be a transfer. A good portion of your secondary, certainly the majority of your rotation in your secondary are going to be transfers. There's going to be a D lineman that works in there. There's going to be a lot of pieces on this team that are going to be new faces, and we'll see them in practice. If I remember right, the plan is that every practice is going to be open to some extent early on, a few periods at the beginning of each practice, everything but the scrimmages. We will see some portion of the media, that is. So we're going to get a look at them. Now, what we can tell, it's hard to say, but Josh Heupel has always been good about having assistants available. And so I would sort of point fans into the direction of, let us see what these assistant coaches say about each of their positions, because they're gonna tip off to us what players look like, what transfers look like, and it'll be easier to project the lineup, the depth chart, once we get out of spring. These coaches sometimes do it in veiled ways, but usually if you listen close enough, you can sort of translate with guys of whether guys are trending into the starting lineup or maybe guys are somewhat of a disappointment. Doesn't take a brain surgeon to figure it out usually.
This is the time of year where sort of 101 of the beat writer playbook is sort of burning questions going into spring practice. And I know you're going to have a more in-depth story on that in about a week that folks can check out over at KnoxNews.com. But just sort of kind of off the jump here, top question facing Tennessee going into spring practice. I'll throw one at you and see what you think of that, or if you would go in a different direction. You mentioned the secondary, and I guess my biggest burning question with Tennessee going into the spring practice is, what the heck do they got in the secondary? We know this has been a group the past couple years that's been exploited at times. And that's sort of reared its head in some of Tennessee's, lower moments the past couple seasons. Can't get out of our heads the game against South Carolina a couple years ago, and there were some strides made, right? But now there's so many faces that Tennessee has to replace in the back end. I mean, do they return any starters from last year in the back end? Nobody's jumping out at me.
No.
Yeah.
They've really, it's not even just the starters, it's the twos also. Tennessee lost 10 defensive backs this offseason. That's 7 transfers and 3 guys that are going into the draft or exhausted their eligibility. So it's 10 guys they've lost. It's really like 6 of them that were in the rotation. Basically, the entire rotation is gone. So, we've thought for these last few years, I think maybe if you're hard on Tennessee, you've said their secondary has been bad for the past 3 years since Josh Heupel and his system have been here. If you're maybe more charitable, you would say they were bad in his first year. They were a little better in the second year, and they were competitive by the third year. I would lean more towards that way. They did show some improvement, more of that bend, don't break mentality. But, I mean, we're going to maybe have some revisionist history about what the secondary has been for the past few years if the one that comes in now is not better. For example, these coaches have leaned on all these veterans in the secondary really the past couple of years. You play seniors, you play fifth year seniors, sixth year seniors, whoever your oldest guy is, you put them out there and you play them because they're experienced. They won't give up as many big plays. Now that they're gone and you plug in other guys, are Tennessee fans going to wish for those veterans to be back if some big plays are given up? Or is this version of the secondary that's more athletic, less experienced, is this going to be a better turn? Tennessee fans would certainly hope for the latter. There's a lot of options, that's for sure, but it's a lot of different parts that have never been fit together because there's so many new ones. You really got two groups in the secondary. You've got the young, talented guys that were signed mostly a year ago, like Ricky Gibson, Jordan Matthews. Those were 4-star corners a year ago. And so now their time has come. Those type of guys. There's more than just that of the younger ones, but you have those younger guys that are going to get their chance. And then you have the transfers. You got an MTSU transfer at safety. You got a Temple transfer at corner. You've got Jermod McCoy, who's the Oregon State transfer, who I think probably is the best of the bunch, maybe the best of the bunch of everybody in the secondary. I'm really curious to see him. He's a really, really good as a young player starter at Oregon State. I'm most curious to see him of all of them. But you've got all these transfers. You've got the young guys. You've got a little bit of guys that have played some, but not much. Andre Turrentine got the pick in the Citrus Bowl. He's probably going to be one of your starting safeties. Jordan Thomas is going to be your star because Tamarian McDonald is gone. So it's a mixture of a lot of different guys. I suspect we will come out of spring practice and the coaches are going to be talking about how much depth they have and balance and, hey, who's your starting 5 in the secondary? Oh, 5. We've got 10.
Right.
That's what's going to be the talk. And I predict we're going to have the same conversation at the end of spring and also fall, which is the difference between depth and balance. Depth means you've got good starters and good backups. Balance means everybody is kind of the same. You can be bad and be balanced. You can be good and be balanced. And so they need depth. They don't need balance. They need good ones and also pretty good twos. So I don't know that we'll have an answer to that by the end of spring, but they definitely need some guys to step forward and claim positions. And I think those transfers are especially important. You have 3 transfers. You need to hit on at least 2 of them as starters.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. I mean, you highlighted Jermon McCoy, and he seems like the plug-and-play guy, or at least you hope he is. If he's not, then I think you got problems in the secondary. But when you just look at his profile, he was a part-time starter for Oregon State, as you said, as a true freshman. Well, if you're starting in a Power 5 league as a true freshman, the expectation is he'd be able to step in and contribute as a starter from day one. But you mentioned 3 key transfers. We've kind of got McCoy penciled in as a starter in one of those 5 spots. How many transfers overall do you think we see starting out there? Do you think all 3 are probably needed to start, or you look at more 2 of the 3?
I think 3 need to be in the rotation. They need Jacoby Thomas, the MTSU transfer, to start at safety. MTSU's had a really good run of safeties all the way back to Kevin Byard, but after that, they've had I think there's 2 All-Pros right now in the NFL from MTSU that were safeties. There's 3 or 4 in current starters in the NFL that were DBs at MTSU. They've churned out a lot of good defensive backs, and Jacoby Thomas is sort of in that line. They need him to be a starter at safety. I think they feel okay about Andre Turrentine. So if you've got those 2 plugged in, that's fine. I think Jordan Thomas is going to be fine at star. And so that means McCoy can start at corner, and then you could sort of sift through the other guys to figure out who they could be. Ricky Gibson seems like an obvious one because he was sort of the heir apparent last year. He started in the Citrus Bowl after all those guys had left. He's the guy that was given a lot of experience as a freshman last year. Jordan Matthews was looked at as maybe the most talented of the bunch, but Ricky Gibson was a close second. Maybe he's a first. It's probably a coin flip, depending on which coach you ask. But, if you can get 3 corners and 3 safeties and 1 star, you've got a secondary. But again, is that depth or is that balance? The one that a lot of Tennessee fans, knowledgeable Tennessee fans listening to this, are saying, where's Boo Carter, the freshman? And I'll go back to the beginning of this episode. I rarely pencil in true freshmen, as making an impact. Boo Carter may be there. Like, I think he's probably going to end up at the star position, but we'll see. But you don't want to hitch your wagon to a true freshman. You want that to be like a pleasant surprise. And there's a lot of options back there at the secondary, but they've got to put the pieces together. But obviously, that's what spring practice is for.
We touched on some of the transfers in the secondary. As I look at the other side of the ball, I know there's more than just these 2, but 2 jump out to me immediately. I'm curious your thoughts on each. The offensive tackle, who you alluded to kind of in the open there, Lance Hurd from LSU. And then also, I thought it was really important that Josh Heupel get another playmaking wide receiver to supplement Brew McCoy and Squirrel White. And, not just a warm body you can roll out there and take up a defender, but a guy who can actually catch 5-6 passes a game. And I thought he did a nice job doing that and getting Chris Brazzell from Tulane. So your thoughts on each of those, and fair to say that both should be expected to be, plug and play type of guys in the offense.
Yeah. And there's a difference of sort of, I think, the ramifications if these guys hit or miss. With Chris Brazzell, if he's a hit, then this offense could be a playoff level offense. If he's a miss, this team can still win 8-9 games because there are other options at wide receiver. It's basically a lot of the same options as last year. They can still win games if Chris Brazzell isn't a hit at wide receiver. It's different for Lance Hurd at offensive tackle. If he's a hit, then he can maybe solidify that offensive line, and maybe we're talking a push to the playoff, maybe. If he's a miss, it's not that you're going to barely miss out on the playoff, like you're going to win 9 games or something like that. You're going to drop off significantly because they just don't have many backup plans on the offensive line. I do think it's important, though, too, with both of these. If we just say the top end of this team, we talked about it a week ago that Tennessee could make the playoff. Like, there's a path there. I'm not predicting that they will, but there is a path for Tennessee to get to the playoff. For them to get that top end type of performance this season at offensive line and wide receiver, and that's the 2 transfers we're talking about, at those 2 position groups, they can't just have their starters work out. Like, Tennessee plays 3 wide receivers. They can't leave spring and say, we got 3 good wide receivers. They have to have 5. You can't make the playoff with 3 really good wide receivers. They need 5. On the offensive line, they can't leave spring practice and say, hey, we got a starting 5. We got 5 good offensive linemen. That's not going to cut it to get to the playoff. You need 7. And I think that's a lesson that we were taught last year because the offensive line had a hiccup with Cooper Mays out, and that sort of derailed the early part of the season. They lost the Florida game for a lot of reasons, but mainly because Cooper Mays wasn't in the lineup. They struggled at times at wide receiver because Brew McCoy went down. They just didn't have a one-to-one replacement. Ramel Keaton was okay, but not really good, and so they suffered at that spot. Dante Thornton didn't work out, and then he got injured. And so you can't just have an answer for your starters. You can't just say, you check the boxes of all the starters and that be it. That's just not going to cut it because we know there's going to be at least 1 wide receiver that gets injured, has every year under Josh Heupel. That just happens with teams. So you're going to need a 4th at least, and I think you probably need 5 to be an elite team. You can win 8-9 games and not have all that much depth. But to get to the playoff, you got to have 5 good wide receivers. You've got to have 7 good offensive linemen. So where do you fill those spots? I mean, at wide receiver, if we look just in spring, Brazzell needs to be a guy. He needs to be a guy that you say, this guy can probably start. but you also probably need Dante Thornton to push him and become this season what they thought he would have been last season. And that's doable. Between Chaz Nimrod and Caleb Webb, those are the two guys that played some last year because of injuries. Played okay, not great, but they're young guys. You need one of those two guys to work out. So if you've got Brazel and you've got Thornton, and then you've got either Webb or Nimrod, that's 3. And then you add in Squirrel White and Brew McCoy, that's 5. Because Squirrel is your guaranteed slot. If Brew McCoy is healthy, which we're not, he's still rehabbing, so we're not going to see him in the spring. But let's say he's healthy in the fall, then you've got 2 of the 3 spots there. Let the other guys fight out for the 3rd spot, but then be able to say you've got a number 4 and a number 5. Offensive line-wise, Lance Hurd, we think he's going to be left tackle. He may be right tackle because John Campbell's at left, but they're probably eventually going to switch those guys. But you've still got a question at left guard. So you've got to fill that spot. And again, you can't go in and say, well, left tackle's filled by Hurd, left guard's filled by whoever. And so you've got your starting 5, you're good to go. That's not going to work. You need competition. And I think this team is better suited to get to the playoff if you leave spring practice without answers to the questions of who your starting 3 is at wide receiver and who your starting 5 is. You need to be enough of a competition that those are up in the air for good reasons.
We've touched on the secondary. We've touched on a couple key transfers, notably Jermon McCoy, the cornerback, and Lance Hurd, the offensive tackle, and how big they are on each side of the ball. What's another, big question that you have going into the spring? And I'm not so much thinking like Nico related, because at least for me anyway, like that question has been dialed down a little bit because we saw him in the bowl game. Now, I'm not saying he was a finished product against Iowa, and Tennessee will face better teams than Iowa. Iowa had a good defense, but nonetheless, I feel like Nico quieted a little bit of questions in the bowl. So I'm thinking something non-Nico related, non-secondary. What's on your mind?
Is there a really good pass rushing option on this defense that's not named James Pierce? We think we know what we're going to get out of Pierce. It's going to be an NFL caliber early round pick, SEC player of the year, maybe even top player. But like if you look at last year, Pierce was really, really good. He had Tyler Barron on the opposite side. In the Citrus Bowl, Pierce played a phenomenal game. Tyree West came on. It's a young guy or a younger guy that came on and played that opposite defensive end spot. You've got to have a strong side defensive end. Maybe that's West. Dominic Bailey has played there. He's good. He's serviceable. He's fine. I think he's played enough now to be able to say that he's going to be solid, but he's not going to be dominant. Tyree West maybe can be more of that. He certainly was really good in the Citrus Bowl. Joshua Josephs is another pass rusher that will play the edge rush position that James Pierce plays, but you'll see them play both together probably on 3rd down on pass rushing opportunities. So who else is it going to be besides Pierce? A lot of the things that we started the pod off with was about the secondary and all that. That secondary is going to look a whole lot better if James Pierce and somebody else is in the face of the opposing quarterback. And we know Pierce is going to get all kinds of attention from opposing offenses. You got to have somebody on the opposite side of that to rush the passer. And so I'll be looking a lot at Tyree West. We'll get Rodney Garner, the D-line coach, during we'll get all the assistant coaches, but on the day we get Garner, Rodney Garner is very good about being painfully honest with his players, but then also at times with media. If there's a guy that he thinks is just not cutting it, he'll kind of pass him by when you ask for any kind of praise that you have of him. But if he thinks that he's got a guy, he'll project that, and he's not scared at all to praise the player and say that he really likes what he's got. Last year, Omar Norman Lott, he said he really liked like his ability to get to from the interior to get to the quarterback and to be disruptive. During the season, we saw that, and that's another guy that will be a good pass rusher for this team. But Rodney Garner said that a year ago, and that came to fruition. A year ago, also, he was very complimentary of Caleb Herring, which was one of the top recruits they got from last year's class. Was not quite ready for prime time. Showed flashes, but was not ready for prime time this last season. He'll be a sophomore this coming year. Maybe he's another guy. Maybe he's a guy that you can mix in with Pierce and Josephs. That's what I'm looking forward to asking Rodney Garner, because they've got to have more pass rushing options to help out that secondary.
All right, so I've intentionally avoided the Nico talk to this point in the pod, but let's lean into it here at the close, because as good as he was against Iowa, it was one game, right? You can't answer all the questions in one game, and so a few things that I'm curious to see out of him going forward, whether that be in the spring or even in September, when the games actually count. We know his athleticism. He proved that against Iowa. We know he can run when he needs to. We know he can make the underneath throws, and he's got an awesome arm. My things that I still want to see from him is, can he make like the full field reads? When the full offense is unleashed upon him, can he make those check downs, those full field reads? You start, your progression on one side and you work your way to the other. And can he make all the throws? I don't question whether his arm's good enough to make all the throws. I know his arm's good enough to make all the throws, but there's a difference between your arm, having the quote unquote arm talent, and being able to make all the throws. I haven't seen anything that suggests to me he can't do those two things, but I thought that was two areas that maybe still need to be proven coming out of how well he played after the bowl game. What are some things you'll be looking for from Nico as you sort of try to check the boxes and see where he is in his progression this spring?
Yeah, I want to see how much he accelerates from what we saw to what he could be this next season. We talked about in the pod last week that week 2 they play NC State in a game that could be very competitive. There's going to be some tests for him early on. He's going to play Oklahoma early in the season at Oklahoma. So, he's got to be ready. It can't be sort of a slow play, this thing, in developing Nico. We loved what we saw in the Citrus Bowl from him, just his running ability, his instincts, threw the ball well at times, did not look like he was rattled at all. But on the flip side of that, let's remind people that I think he had like 167 yards of total offense. Now, he didn't need it. It was a 35-0 game. Ran 3 touchdowns through for a fourth, but, threw for like $150 and ran a little bit. It wasn't like a huge performance. It was just a good, timely performance. He was good around the goal line, didn't make mistakes. So there's a lot more there to do. He took 6 sacks also. I know this is a small sample, but he took 6 sacks, held the ball too long. So, again, I'll say this. We can see some in practice. Media can. And we'll be able to see, like, him making all the throws, as you alluded to. We'll see how quick his progressions are in some drills that we see. But I'm as curious, maybe even more so, to hear what Joey Halsley says about Nico. I talked about Rodney Garner on the defensive side. It's Joey Halsley for me on the offensive side, a guy who will actually tell you what he's thinking and will tell you how guys are progressing or not progressing, what's giving them trouble, what they prefer and what they do. And that's really especially important with quarterbacks. Joey Halsley, the offensive coordinator, longtime quarterbacks coach, he would always tell us what Hendon Hooker was working on, or what Joe Milton was doing well at, what he was not doing well at. He'll tell us that about Nico. And I just want to know, what's the next step for Nico? A year ago, he was not starting because his decision-making and his progressions were not sped up enough. He was holding the ball too long. He was making mistakes, as all freshmen do. That's why he wasn't starting over Joe Milton to begin with. I want to know if that stuff is cut out now, if he's gone from 30 miles an hour to 60 miles an hour now, and how much further he can go. But I want to know that from Joey Halsley, and I think he'll probably give us an honest answer. I also want to hear from Nico, how he's approaching the job now in this season. He's an extremely humble kid. Every time, we didn't talk to him much last year, but when we did, it was always about all the things that Joe Milton is doing for him and how this is his mentor and he's just sitting and learning. all these modest attributes he was showing. Doesn't have to show that anymore. He's the guy. He's QB1. I want to know what his mentality is going forward. Does he have a little bit of a swagger? Does he take on some of the leadership responsibilities? Is he telling Joey Halzle what he wants to do in the offense and what he's not comfortable doing? Because Hendon Hooker did that really well, and Joe Milton at times did that well. Are there certain throws you just don't feel comfortable in? You tell Joey Halzle that's cut out of the playbook or that's retooled. I want to see how he is in the pocket. A lot of the progression issues that he had, again, typical freshman issues that he had a year ago, was him throwing in the pocket. That's where the sacks come from. I want to know that he can take a 5-step drop and throw the ball on time, because we know he can get out on the run and throw on the run, rollouts, bootlegs, all that. We saw that in the bowl game, but there's got to be something beyond that, because teams are going to try to keep him in the pocket after what he did in the Citrus Bowl. And I want to know that he can hang in there and throw it. And that goes back to what we talked about before, is who are his wide receivers, and can he get a rapport with those guys? Because, he threw to Webb and Nimrod a lot last year, because those guys were twos most of the year. He threw to Dante Thornton at times last year because he was a 2. He actually has less time with Squirrel than any of them, and Squirrel may be their leading receiver this year, as he was last year. So I want to know kind of who has the rapport with him. Last season, Ramel Keaton and Joe Milton had sort of a connection all the offseason. I don't think Nico's going to pick out his guy, but you may be able to sort of read between the lines of who his guy is, and that'll help that guy get in the lineup.
Adam, I know you're days away from traveling to Japan for this vacation. I mentioned that you're going to squeeze in before the start of spring practice. We going to have any Tokyo datelines from you, or you got everything in the can that you need to have done before spring here?
There's a thing that I was alerted to a couple weeks ago, that we've been fixing our itinerary for Tokyo, and there is a sports bar in Tokyo called the Good Old Tennessee Bar, Good Old Tennessee Sports Bar or something, and it's a Tennessee Vols. It's a UT bar. I Googled it. I don't know quite the story behind it exactly, but I think it's like a UT grad or UT fan who decided to open a sports bar with a Vols theme over there. So if we can get out there.
Yeah, you got to have a story on that.
Yeah, I'm also thinking, like, if I shoot a 90-second video and I talk to the guy to do a story when I get home, like, do I get one night of my Tokyo hotel paid for? Does the paper do that?
Maybe in the good old days. I think you and I miss the good old days. You've been at this a little longer than I have, but I don't think you even caught the good old days. You might be able to expense the meal, but that's probably about as far as you could get.
Yeah, I had an editor many years ago who did like a 2-week Canadian trip, I think an NHL trip, and he would do one column per week, so then he could expense the entire week. So that was the quote unquote good old days that we're talking about. If people don't know that in journalism, that's what we're talking about. When expense reports just didn't matter where the decimal point was, you just turned them in and they were paid. But
well, it matters now, and so support Adam's work and support his travels by checking out his pre-spring content over at KnoxNews.com. It'll be underway on March 18th, and Adam will be back at that time, and we'll have him back at the pod to bring us up to speed on what he's seen first few days out of spring practice. Thanks for listening to this edition of the Volunteer State.